Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Faces on the Front Line. I'm Leadership Program Director for the Gettysburg Foundation, Britt Isenberg, and I'm very pleased to be joined and honored to be joined by Chief of Interpretation here at Gettysburg National Military Park and a really good friend of the Gettysburg Foundation, Chris Gwinn. Chris, thank you for joining us
Absolutely,
today.
happy to be here.
So we left you, we're not to Gettysburg yet, we're on our way into Pennsylvania. And we want to kind of continuing our story about those individuals that made history in 1863, maybe in a slightly different direction than most people are familiar with, but maybe haven't taken a deep dive on.
Okay.
And I'm talking about Thaddeus Stevens. Could you tell us a little about Thaddeus Stevens and his role in the Gettysburg campaign? Or his
I'd be happy to. So I think if most Americans are aware of Thaddeus Stevens at all, it's because they saw the 2012 movie Lincoln, in which the character of Thaddeus Stevens is played by Tommy Lee Jones, and he's one of the kind of central figures, along with Lincoln, in that film. But he really is one of the unheralded heroes of the American story. Now, he figures in the Gettysburg story, the Gettysburg campaign, for I think one big reason. On June 26, 1863, as Jubal Early's division of Confederates are actually marching towards the town of Gettysburg, they cross over the South Mountains and they pass an ironworks, which happened to be owned by Thaddeus Stevens.
Okay.
And they ultimately end up burning that to the ground. Now, they're doing that for a couple reasons. One, of course, is, iron is important for the Union war effort. By destroying that, they're striking a blow to the Union cause. But beyond that, Thaddeus Stevens symbolically was, in a lot of ways, what the Confederate forces were fighting against. Thaddeus Stevens is what we would call today a radical Republican at the time of the American Civil War. And so the idea that they were going to burn down his property and strike kind of a blow to him personally was something that I think would have resonated certainly with Jubal Early and a lot of the men he commanded.
It's a real exclamation mark, is it not? Well, so let's continue eastward a little bit, if you don't mind. And we'll throw another connection in there, knowing Thaddeus Stevens' long political career. Of course, most of our viewers are very familiar with the McPherson farm, owned by Edward McPherson, who also plays into the Thaddeus Stevens story a little bit later in '63. He's the clerk of Congress. He's the one that's there recording the votes for the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and more. But what kind of connection does Stevens himself have to the community of Gettysburg?
Well, so Thaddeus Stevens is actually not a Gettysburgian by birth. He'll ultimately live here. He's actually born in Vermont. He had a difficult childhood. So first of all, he was born with a physical disability. He had what they referred to then as a clubbed foot, and that caused him to have a fairly pronounced limp throughout his life. His father leaves the family when he's very, very young, and so he's got a lot kind of working against him, but he believed a lot, and his mother believed a lot in the value of getting an education. So ultimately he graduates from Dartmouth College, moves south to Pennsylvania, becomes a lawyer, and he settles in Gettysburg. And he establishes ultimately a very successful law career, practicing in Gettysburg and Adams County, amasses a fair amount of real estate, and so he becomes very much a prominent citizen of the community. Some of the land that Stevens would purchase ultimately becomes part of the campus of what is today Gettysburg College, Pennsylvania College, in the 19th century. So he's a big figure in terms of Adams County. Now, by the time of the American Civil War, he's moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he's elected to the House of Representatives. But as I mentioned earlier, he is a radical Republican. So he joins the Republican Party not long after its formation. And he believed very much in the evils of the institution of slavery. And he dedicates his life, both his personal life and his political career, to the eradication of what he considered an abomination, the institution of slavery. And so when you think about the differences between North and South, when you think about this abolitionist movement that a lot of white Southerners fear, it's really embodied by this guy, Thaddeus Stevens, who will pressure the Lincoln administration to make this a war about slavery, to make this a war that is not just about restoring an old union, but in many ways crafting a new one, a better one. And so he's that central figure, and not many people know that he is a Gettysburgian. He lived here, he worked here, he was part of this community. So what Thaddeus Stevens represents to me is the promise of what America could be.
Yeah.
So as Americans, we like to say we believe certain things, that all men are created equal, that we live in a democracy, that your vote and my vote, they count the same, and that we all have a role to play in the government that governs us.
Yeah.
That wasn't always true. And we still strive for that today. And it didn't suddenly just become manifest. People had to work for that. People had to fight for that. Now, a lot of times when we talk about the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg, we just think about the soldiers who are fighting on the front lines. But it's important for us to recognize that there's a lot of ways to fight that battle. And one of the ways that you have to fight that kind of battle is through the political process. And to me, that's what Thaddeus Stevens represents.
Yeah.
He's a guy that starts from almost nothing, who has a lot of obstacles thrown in his path, but he believes in the fundamental humanity of all people, and that everyone should play a role in making this American experiment possible. And he dedicates his life to that.
Yeah.
So every time you cast a vote, every time you take part in the electoral process, what you're doing is you're part of that legacy that Thaddeus Stevens has kind of bequeathed to us Americans.
Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you. Folks, please stay tuned. We're now on our way into Gettysburg. We're going to continue this story of Faces on the Front Lines and talk about that civilian impact as we move forward into our next story. So please join us for the next one. Thank you.